and livestock was mostly what they exported. And in New England, as was the case typically, a few rich people got most of the wealth. However, the average person in New England was still better off than most Europeans. This was beginning, even in colonial times, where the colonial peoples were richer than the average person in Europe. This was the beginning, and this was to continue. And I'll give you one reason why. Money. The New England people and American colonials passed around paper money. People would accept paper money as payment, and this was something that was found on the old world. But paper money had a lot to do with making Americans think that they were rich. Now, going from New England to the middle colonies, and with the middle colonies I'm talking about New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. Well, not Maryland. Maryland was Chesapeake Island. New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. These were the middle colonies. Their population grew faster than did the population of the New England colonies, partly because of William Penn's more relaxed rules on religious affiliation, and they took in a more diverse group of people. People from Sweden came to New Jersey, and the people from Germany came to Pennsylvania. Now, from the time I was 2 to the time I was 11, I lived in Pennsylvania, so I have a little bit of affinity with Pennsylvanians. The Pennsylvania Dutch, they are not Hollanders, they are Germans who came from Germany to Pennsylvania, and they're called the Pennsylvania Dutch. Don't ask me why they should be called Pennsylvania Germans. I am personally descended from a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch. The name Cunningham is Scotch. In my genealogy I have Irish, Scotch, and Dutch. The Scotch-Irish. The Scotch-Irish are Scotsmen who went to Ireland first, and then went from Ireland to mostly Pennsylvania, but the Scotch-Irish make up a lot of Pennsylvanians. Scotsmen in Pennsylvania tended to be, well, Presbyterian. I've got to include, that's in your book, folk. My grandfather was a Pennsylvanian. He was Presbyterian. And my great-grandfather was Presbyterian, and my great-aunt, who lived to be almost 100, she was Presbyterian. My dad grew up Presbyterian. So Presbyterians, a lot of the Scotsmen who went to Pennsylvania were Presbyterians. The people in the middle colonies were less English. I mean, they were less English than the people in New England, because they had a lot of Scotch, a lot of Irish, a lot of Germans, and even some Swedes. The reason they came over, they had a desire to live better in the New World than they did in the Old, and they believed that they could do better in the Old World than they did in the New. And for the most part, we have. But they came over for a better life. Eventually, the threat of religious persecution died. Countries like Holland and England gave religious freedom, and a lot of your German countries did too. Now, Germany was not a country till 1870. So when I say German, Germany was a geographic term. I mean, I had a person tell me recently, Scandinavia is not a country. No, but it's a geographical term. There is a place in this world called Scandinavia, and it's correct. Korea is not a country either. Neither is Arabia. But Arabia is a geographic term, and so is Korea as a geographic term. So when I say Germany, before 1870, it's a geographic term. Because there was no nation called Germany. But anyway, the Germans, people from Germany came over. Now, as it was a case of New England, New Englanders generally did not use slave labor. Now, I've told you already that there was a slave girl who was heavily involved in the Salem witchcraft situation. Her name was Tatu, but don't worry about the name. But the Pennsylvanians did not use a lot of slave labor either. They realized early on that slaves did not do a good job, and slaves tended to run away or tended to shirk because they didn't like being slaves. So they didn't use slave labor. Mostly the people who owned land got and did a lot of the work themselves, and they used their children. They would have a lot of children, and their children would go out and work on the farm. And the fathers would teach their children, mothers teach their children farm work. So they would use their children. Philadelphia became a big trading center. If you know anything about Philadelphia, Philadelphia is located where the Susquehanna River empties into the ocean, and big ships can still come into Philadelphia. And Philadelphia then became a trading center. A lot of Quakers living in Philadelphia became rich. And again, the people in the middle colonies, the average person lived better than they did almost anywhere else. So the two products that Pennsylvania had to offer, and they still do, dairy farm, cattle farming, and wheat. And again, if you visit eastern Pennsylvania, you'll find a whole lot of wheat farms. Yes, wheat farm galore. Again, this was true from the beginning and is still true. Dairy farming, Pennsylvanians raise a lot of cattle. So do the people of New Jersey, and they farm dairy products. They have wheat farm, and the Quakers would take the wheat and make oats out of it, and that's why we get Quaker oats, which still you find on the market. I've grown up with Quaker oats all my life. Don't eat it much anymore, though. The South, unlike the New England colony, the middle colony, the South quickly became a land of slavery. Somehow the southern climate was more conducive to slave labor owing to the fact that tobacco required a lot of labor, and so did rice. And also the type of labor rice required. Rice plants start out growing underwater, and to tend to it you have to wade in the water. White people generally preferred not to do that. Slaves had no choice, so slaves were put to working the rice fields, rice paddies. Tobacco remained the main crop in the Chesapeake region. I'm talking about Virginia and Maryland, and even North Carolina. Now, sometimes we lump the Carolinas together in the Carolina, but the North Carolina had a different economy in South Carolina. North Carolina was still a land of tobacco. South Carolina became a land of rice and indigo. We wonder what indigo. Indigo is used to make blue dyes. Now, the last crop in this was Georgia. Folk, again, you understand people were trying, and to start a colony that would be perfect. Georgia did not attract many settlers at first. Georgia was the last of the 13 colonies. And at first, the man who founded it, James Oglethorpe by name, I don't think his name is on the test. I'm not going to write it down. But James Oglethorpe wanted to found Georgia as a land for the very, very poor, the debtors, particularly, even though in the long run, I've read, no debtors actually came. But Georgia was a land that initially had outlawed slavery, outlawed drinking alcohol, outlawed smoking tobacco, outlawed a lot of vices that, again, you might think it was somewhat Puritan. Perhaps it was. I don't know what Oglethorpe's really beliefs were. But until Georgia legalized slavery and legalized gambling and legalized drinking and legalized brothels and a few other things that you might wish they wouldn't have, but until Georgia legalized this, Georgia did not attract hardly any colonists. Then when Georgia legalized some of these vices, the doors opened and colonies started coming in. The problem with Georgia, though, it was close to Florida, still is, and a lot of Georgians worried about the Spanish coming up in Florida. The Spanish were afraid of the English settling in Georgia, and the Georgians were afraid of the Spanish encroaching on them. And this led to one war called the War of Jenkins' Ear, where the Spanish cut off a man named Jenkins' ear, and this led to a war between the colonists, between England and Spain. England and Spain were to fight many wars at this time. To make a long story short, eventually Spain lost Florida. Spain lost its control of Florida, and Georgia was to become Georgia wound up becoming the biggest state east of the Mississippi after Virginia was split in two during the Civil War. But at one time Virginia was the biggest state, but now today it's Georgia. A lot of the people who initially moved into Georgia were persons from fringe religious groups, the Mennonites and the Moravians. If you know anything about the Mennonites, they're a lot like the Amish. The Amish, Mennonites, Moravians, extremely Christian, but they live in communes, and still a lot of them still do. And they don't take anyone in. If you know, to become a Mennonite, you have to be born into it. To become an Amish, you're born into it. But they live in these communes, and they stick to their old rules. And a lot of them will not drive cars. I'm jumping around in the story a little bit, but anyway, they're still around. And but these were the type of people who settled in Georgia at first. Anyway, Georgia became a plantation center also, like South Carolina. Plantation cotton became a big crop after a while, and still is. Now, in the South, eventually, slave owners began to dominate Southern politics. Your Southern colonies became polarized. Your rich were extremely, extremely rich, and your poor were very, very poor. The term yeoman refers to a farmer who owns a small plot of land on which he can barely subsist, and he and his family work that land. He's too poor to own a slave. And a lot of Southern people living at this time were what you call yeoman farmers. Farmers with a very small plot of land of maybe an acre or two that they just barely enough to feed them and their families. But then you had your big plantation owners, and a lot of times they grew two crops, either tobacco or eventually cotton, tobacco, cotton. And these big plantations would have slave houses where the slaves lived. Throughout the colonies, the majority of their religions were a form of Protestantism, and this was true even in Maryland. Maryland started out as a Catholic colony. I think we just had a man named Lord Baltimore. There was a time in England when some of the Protestant kings tried to outlaw Catholicism. It did not work. But anyway, Lord Baltimore was himself a Catholic, and he wanted to found a Catholic haven in the New World, so he went to Maryland along the Chesapeake and founded the city of Baltimore that bears his name. But even in Maryland, the majority of the colonists there were Protestant. Now I want to say this about, if this was true in England and in Europe, throughout Europe, the countries that allowed religious freedom became richer than the ones that didn't. And I'll name the names. Scandinavia allowed religious tolerance, Holland and England, and some of your German countries. And the ones that didn't became poor, among them Spain and Portugal and Italy. These countries did not have religious tolerance, and I think largely as a result they became poor. There seems to be a connection between freedom, the freedom of religion, and wealth of the persons living in these countries. And the United States, most of its colonies quickly allowed freedom of religion. New England was slower than other parts of the country. Now, as wealth increased, people became less religious. That is for a time. However, these things go in cycles. About the middle of the 1700s, a big revival occurred called the Great Awakening. Preachers preached fiery sermons against sin and against the vices of their day. The number one and number two preachers were Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. Now, I've heard this name pronounced Whitfield. Any of you who think you know, you're welcome to pronounce it. But there's a county in Georgia called Whitfield County, and they pronounce it Whitfield. But I've heard it pronounced Whitefield. But these were two of the main preachers. There were several others. Jonathan Edwards is famous for his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and the people would scream out, "Oh, please, please stop," as he would preach about what was going to happen to persons who died in how that God was going to put him through a whole lot of misery in the afterlife that would last on and on. This sermon terrified his congregation, even though it's known he actually only preached this sermon maybe once in his career, or once in his lifetime, but nevertheless, that's the sermon he preached that's come down to memory. Whitefield and Ben Franklin, oh, they were opposites, but Ben Franklin had a knack for being friends with people who were opposite him. He later became friends even with George III. But Ben Franklin attended Whitefield's meetings one time, and it was said that Whitefield motivated Ben Franklin to empty out his purse when a collection was being taken around. Ben Franklin, of course, being very rich, did not carry a whole lot of money in his purse at any one time. Most of his money was in the bank. Whenever he even influenced Ben Franklin. The two of them, like I say, different though they both knew they were, they took a liking to each other. Jonathan Edwards wound up being kicked out of his congregation, as was the case of so many preachers. Again, well, he made one mistake. I'll go into a little bit of detail. I mean, there was some young men got a hold of a book about how to deliver babies, and these were men ages 15 to 21, all of them unmarried. They started passing. This book had some explicit, vivid descriptions of the female anatomy. Now, and it basically was what we might call pornography when in the wrong hands. Jonathan Edwards' job as pastor, he should have been to call these young men into his office one at a time and counsel with them and do it privately. Instead, he got in front of the whole congregation, made a public example out of them, and some of these men were from prominent families. They rose up and drove him out of town. Again, I think that Edwards was wrong. Is what he should have done and what other preachers might have done was privately counsel these young men and hopefully get them on the right track. But anyway, again, a man can go for many, many years and make one mistake and lose everything he's worked for. All right. Anyway, the great revivals, they did a lot to convince people that they could determine their own salvation. And they did a lot to undermine the doctrine of predestination. So that was maybe their one good. Now, there wound up being three revival movements. There was a revival movement called the Great Awakening here. Then there came the Second Great Awakening that occurred during the time of presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Then the last big revival movement occurred in 1857, just before the Civil War. And when that revival was over, we haven't had a big revival movement since.